Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first lecture of the semester. For this lecture, I'm covering a little bit of chapter 1 and 2, or really some of the connective ideas that I think are most important. Um, and really, for these first couple of weeks, we're really focusing on the idea of leadership theory, some of the strategies behind leadership, and kind of seeing the similarities of the way that some of these leadership strategies and theories play out in other industries and how they can be specifically applied to the sports industry. Like I mentioned in the introduction video, I don't specifically go over the case studies during my lectures, but if you do have time to go through them, I think there are some beneficial tidbits that you can get from going through those case studies if you have some time. I know we're kind of going through this book pretty quickly over these next 8 weeks, but if you are the type of person who is really interested beyond kind of the bold words that I told you to focus on for the class, I think it'd be really beneficial for you to go back and look at some of those case studies. And it's also why, in addition to the book, I wanted to bring in ideas from my lectures, but also bring in ideas from the interviews that I'll be posting on later in the semester. But let's go ahead and talk about some of these ideas from the book. And one of the things that I really love, I love the fact that they start the entire book by focusing on the idea that leadership isn't just a title or a role, but it's the behavior that you exhibit when you're in that role, right? Because I'm sure we all have known people who have potentially have gotten a job based on the people that they knew and not necessarily based on their skills or experience or their expertise. Now, whether they succeeded or failed, that's beyond the point, but there are a number of ways that you can enter into a leadership position or ascend into a leadership position purely based on how you behave and the way you act with the people around you and the way you interact with your team members, right? They do a really phenomenal job talking about the different type of power that you have when you're in a leadership position, but they also talk about the different type of leadership traits and different theories and the way that there is almost this idea, and I see it on a personal level when I used to teach undergraduate students, and sometimes in my graduate students as well. When you put people in a group for a group project of some kind, right? There is always someone who just emerges as a natural leader. Now, it could be a number of things. It could be charisma. I know they talk about that in the book. There are some folks who just naturally are more talkative, and that in turn turns into them becoming the kind of de facto leader. But that just proves the point that it's not necessarily only about what your title and your role is, but it really kind of comes down to how you are acting and behaving and communicating when you're in that role. Now, they go over a bunch of different theories when it comes to leadership, but one thing that I really enjoy about the first chapter is when they talk about the path goal theory of leadership, right? This idea that leaderships can affect the attainment of a goal based on how they motivate their followers or their team members, right? So it's about making sure that that leader is setting clear expectations and goals for their subordinates. They're showing concern for the subordinates' health and well-being, actively communicating with subordinates, and requesting shared decision-making, and setting high expectations and goals and being able to motivate their team. Now, two of those things that I think really separate this theory from some of the other ones are the middle two, right? Making sure that you are showing concern for your subordinates' health and well-being, and that you're requesting shared decision-making, right? One thing I kind of reiterate, not just in this class, but in many of my leadership classes, is the importance of making sure your team is included in what you're doing, right? Obviously, ultimately, you are the final decision maker, but I've seen far too many leaders kind of cut off possibilities and cut off creativity because they aren't letting their team be part of the process and be part of the decision making, right? They're not empowering their team to be part of the process, right? Obviously, if you're hiring someone, you're of the belief that they can do their job, right? But there are still so many leaders that kind of hover on and micromanage, and don't allow someone to really bloom into the leader that they could potentially be. And really, they kind of fall short in providing an asset to the entire team by allowing that person to succeed. So that's something I really enjoy out of chapter 1. In terms of chapter 2, I like that they lay out the different types of leadership approaches that people can have. You know, they highlight the fact that transformational leadership is really focused on motivation, right? Like, I don't believe I put the video up for this class, but I think I'll end up putting it for next week. It's really short, but there's a bunch of studies that have been done that show that while a lot of us seem to think that money could be the biggest motivating factor for people to be productive when they're in the workplace, a lot of these studies show that that only goes to a certain level. And then once you max out at a particular price point or salary point, it all becomes the same for people, right? There might be a little bit more productivity, but then it kind of tails off. But what does help is when people feel empowered in the workplace, when people feel like they are part of a team and they're communicating well with one another. I know in the video that I'll post up on Blackboard, they talk about the fact that one company decided that they would just, for 48 hours or 24 hours, they would allow teams once a month to work on whatever project they want. So they could put aside whatever the company wanted them to work on, and they could work on whatever they wanted. The only thing is, after that time was up, they would then have to present their findings to the team. Right. What that ended up doing is creating a lot of different projects that people weren't even thinking of in the first place, and coming up with ideas on fixing bugs for whatever programs that they already had. Little things like that motivate people, and transformational leadership is all about that idea of creating an environment that motivates people to be productive and motivates people to want to succeed and help the company and organization to succeed. They talk about transactional leadership, right? And I think that's what a lot of people kind of get stuck on, this idea of, I hired you to do a job, I'm paying you to do a job, so just do your job, and that's how this transaction's working. But I think a lot of us already know that that's not motivation enough for people to be, because it's one thing to be complacent, right? Like, I'm getting paid to do this job and I'm going to do this job, but it's another thing to be excited about what you're doing, to feel inspired by the organization that you're working for. And in turn, that will lead to more productivity and more engagement and higher morale, which all of those things lead to more success. And we see it very clearly in the sports world, right? Where you see some players being willing to take a lower salary because they like a particular coach, they like a particular city. And there are going to be some players that prefer just, hey, I want to make as much money as I can in this small, limited career that I'm going to have. But you do see examples of this idea of going beyond just making money, and that the transactions are only going to go so far, right? There are a number of stories of players that go to a particular team because they're going to make a lot of money, but they end up with a coach that they don't necessarily agree with, but they don't get along with, right? And that's where you see some of the disconnect, right, between the front office of an organization that's making the decisions when it comes to which coach they're hiring, which players they're bringing in, which players are going to scout, and the disconnect that might be between that front office and the coaching staff, right? And what their ideas of success and their strategies for success, they might not align very well. A lot of that has to do because people are of this mentality of like, I'm hiring you to do a job, so just do your job, but not really paying attention to things like organizational culture, the individual and what they bring to the team beyond just their skill set, and considering the different communication factors that are going on when you're thinking about team members. And lastly, they get into servant leadership. And this focuses on the interaction between leader and follower, and emphasizes how leaders can be attentive to the needs of followers, show concern for their followers, and nurture and emphasize the needs of their followers. They place the interests, needs, and aspirations of others before their own. And I think that's, we're seeing a big transformation in the sports industry currently, just with everything going on in terms of racial inequality and the big conversations that have been going on with sports, especially this last week or so. We've seen multiple NBA teams just, essentially they're going on strike. And as of, let's say 4 years ago, when we're talking about issues, or we're talking about situations like with Colin Kaepernick, the conversations that were going on were much different then than they are now. And a lot of it, regardless of how you feel about some of the things that are going on and maybe potentially why some of these players are doing what they're doing, a lot of the support that they're now getting from their front office comes from a place of servant leadership. I thought it'd be interesting to read a statement from the Baltimore Ravens, because I think it really highlights this idea, in that if you're talking about servant leadership, you are understanding the fact that even though a front office GM or owner of a particular team might not have the same views as their players, they understand that the players are their employees and are essential for the team and what they're doing in the organization and what they're doing. And they are putting the needs and aspirations of that team and those players before themselves, right? So I'm going to go ahead and read this to you all. With yet another example of racial discrimination with the shooting of Jacob Blake and the unlawful abuse of peaceful protesters, we must unify as a society. It is imperative that all people, regardless of race, religion, creed, or belief, come together to say enough is enough. This is bigger than sports. Racism is embedded in the fabric of our nation's foundation and is a blemish on our country's history. If we are to change course and make our world a better place, we must face this problem head on and act now to enact positive change. It is time to accept accountability and acknowledge the ramifications of slavery and racial injustice. Though we cannot right all the wrongs of our country's history, we can, and they list a few things here. Arrest and charge the police officers responsible for Breonna Taylor's killing and the shooting of Jacob Blake. Demand that Senator Mitch McConnell bring the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2020 to the Senate floor for vote. End qualified immunity, require body cameras, ban chokehold and no-knock warrants, hold police accountable in court, establish a framework to prohibit racial profiling at federal, state, and local levels. Support state and federally mandated CALEA accreditation and national standards for care and policing. Encourage everyone to engage in the political process by registering to vote on both the local and national level. Demand prison sentencing reform that is fair and equitable. Encourage every citizen to act with respect and compliance when engaging with the police. If you feel that there has been an abuse of power, we encourage you to contact your police department's internal affairs unit. That's the end of the list there, and they say we will use our platform to drive change, not just for our generation, but for the generations that follow, for our sons and daughters, and for their children. Now, something to keep in mind is that the majority of NFL players are black. The majority, if not all, of NFL owners are white. And in terms of the fan base, it's pretty split in terms of if you're looking at it politically. However, if we're talking and focusing in on servant leadership, these owners have taken the time over these last 4 years to say, look, there's clearly something going on that we need to pay attention and listen to. And we're going to listen to our players. And if you listen to that statement and really break it down, there is not a we are leaning one side or the other. We are really focusing on racial inequality. And this is something that clearly is important to our players and their community. So I am going to allow them to lead and I will follow in this instance. Right? And you're seeing it league-wide. You're seeing it in the NBA. You're seeing it in the WNBA. They've been doing that actually for quite a long time. They've kind of been at the forefront of a lot of these movements. But that is a prime example of servant leadership, of allowing players that autonomy to make those decisions. And again, I'm sure that we could have a conversation extensively of people who agree or disagree about some of the topics that are coming up around these protests and these strikes. But that's not specifically what we're focusing on for this conversation, but we're focusing on the idea that this is a prime example of servant leadership, where you have heard some of these owners in the past talk about that they don't like some of these protests. They prefer players who do X, Y, and Z. They don't want to allow their players to do that. And a lot of that has now changed given the fact that many of these players, and you hear it all, I've been hearing it all summer, right? Where a lot of these teams are entering meetings where they're talking to owners and they're talking to front office staff so that a real true conversation can happen where statements like this and actions like this can take place. So that's what I wanted to talk about for today. I wanted to show kind of that connection there between the path goal theory of leadership, servant leadership, and kind of the things that we're seeing going on currently in the sports industry. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email, shoot me a text, stop by my office hours. But that is the first lecture of the semester.